My name is Hannah Reyes. I'm 33 years old. And until the night of my mother-in-law's 60th birthday dinner, I still believed that a signature meant something in every room of my life, not just the ones I got paid to sit in. Real family doesn't need written agreements, Sandra announced to 18 relatives seated around two pushed-together tables at Antonio's, the same Italian restaurant where she'd celebrated every milestone birthday for the past decade. She said it with a small, theatrical laugh, the kind meant to invite everyone else into agreeing with her before they'd had time to actually think about what she was agreeing to. Hannah made Marcus's own mother sign paperwork, like I was some kind of stranger asking for a favor. Several relatives chuckled uncomfortably. My father-in-law, Gerald, stared very hard at his lasagna. Marcus, my husband, said nothing at all, which told me everything about which side of this particular table he had already decided to stand on. I smiled, took a slow sip of water, and said only 2 words. "Noted, Sandra." She mistook my calm for defeat, the way people usually do right before they discover it was actually the last thing they should have wanted. What she did not know, sitting there enjoying the small ripple of laughter at my expense, was that 7 months earlier, when she had asked to borrow $31,000 for what she described as a medical emergency, I had not simply had her sign a piece of paper. I had drafted, reviewed, and had properly witnessed a fully enforceable personal loan agreement, the exact same instrument I drafted professionally 40 hours a week for people borrowing considerably less than family members, somehow believed they were entitled to borrow for free. Before I tell you exactly what I did the morning after that dinner, and what happened when Sandra discovered precisely how enforceable real family paperwork actually is, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and where you're watching this from. I want to know how far tonight's story travels. For 9 years, I had worked as a commercial loan underwriter for a regional credit union in Ohio, evaluating everything from small business expansion requests to personal debt consolidation loans, spending my days analyzing credit histories, income verification documents, and collateral valuations to determine, essentially, how much risk a given borrower actually represented before any money changed hands. My job existed because people are, on average, considerably more optimistic about their own reliability than the numbers usually justify, and because financial institutions have learned, often through expensive mistakes, that verbal promises and good intentions rarely survive contact with an unexpected expense 6 months down the road. I was good at my job because I had spent nearly a decade learning to separate what people said about their finances from what their actual documentation revealed, a skill that, I would eventually discover, applied just as precisely to family members as it did to strangers applying for auto loans. I met Marcus 8 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue, and for the first several years of our relationship, his mother, Sandra, struck me as warm in the specific, performative way some people are warm precisely, because performing warmth has always gotten them exactly what they wanted from everyone around them. She hosted elaborate holiday dinners, remembered everyone's birthdays with theatrical enthusiasm, and had a talent for making each person at any gathering feel briefly like the most important guest in the room. It took me nearly 3 years of marriage to Marcus to notice the pattern underneath that warmth, that Sandra's generosity, real as it sometimes was, existed alongside an equally consistent expectation that generosity flow primarily in her direction, and that anyone who suggested otherwise had somehow failed to understand what family actually meant. Marcus's younger brother, Dominic, had spent most of his adult life orbiting Sandra's financial support, first through college expenses that stretched 2 years beyond a normal degree timeline, then through a series of business ventures, a food truck that lasted 8 months, an online resale business that never quite launched, each one funded partially by Sandra, and I would later learn, considerably more than partially by money that was never actually hers to give. I should have paid closer attention to a story Marcus's aunt, Rosalie, mentioned in passing at a cookout 2 years before any of this began, told with the kind of resigned humor people use when they've stopped expecting an outcome to change. Rosalie mentioned that she had once lent Sandra $4,000 for what Sandra described as an urgent car repair, money that took nearly 3 years and considerable awkwardness to recover. And only then, because Rosalie had finally stopped asking politely and simply told Sandra she would mention it at the next Thanksgiving dinner if it remained unpaid. Everyone at the cookout laughed when Rosalie told the story. The specific laugh families used to convert a genuine grievance into a harmless anecdote about a relative's quirky relationship with money. I laughed along with everyone else at the time, filing it away as a minor personality trait rather than what I now understand it actually was. A data point in a much longer pattern I simply hadn't yet gathered enough information to recognize. I think about that cookout often now, the way you think about a warning sign you walked past without registering it as a warning at all. Sandra called me directly on a Tuesday evening in March, which was itself unusual, since she typically routed any financial requests through Marcus first, letting him absorb whatever initial resistance existed before she ever entered the conversation herself. Her voice carried a controlled urgency I hadn't heard from her before, describing a sudden, serious health complication requiring immediate treatment, a procedure her insurance would only partially cover, leaving her with an out-of-pocket obligation of just under $31,000 that the hospital needed committed to within 2 weeks or risk losing her scheduled treatment slot. She told me she hated asking, that she had exhausted every other option, that she trusted Marcus and me more than anyone else in the family to understand the seriousness of the situation without turning it into a production. I want to be honest that some part of me, even then, noticed the specificity of the number, 31,000 rather than a rounder figure, the kind of precision that usually accompanies either a genuine, itemized medical bill or a carefully calculated story designed to sound like one. I did not act on that instinct immediately, partly because accusing your mother-in-law of fabricating a health crisis is not a conversation anyone enters lightly, and partly because Marcus, when I raised the request with him that same night, was already halfway to agreeing before I finished the sentence, his mother's health apparently not a category of request that invited the same scrutiny I applied to every other financial decision in our marriage. I told Marcus I supported helping his mother, which was true, but that given the size of the amount, I wanted the loan documented properly, not because I distrusted Sandra specifically, but because $31,000 was not a sum either of us could comfortably absorb as a loss if repayment somehow never materialized, and because, professionally, I had watched enough undocumented family loans dissolve into resentment and confusion to know that clarity up front protects relationships far more reliably than assumed goodwill does. Marcus resisted the idea mildly, telling me it felt cold to ask his own mother to sign something during a medical crisis, but eventually agreed when I framed it, gently, as protecting Sandra just as much as us, a clear record that would prevent any future confusion about what had been given as a gift versus what had been extended as a loan expecting repayment. I drafted the agreement myself, using the same template structure I used professionally for personal loans between private parties. A simple document specifying the principal amount, a modest interest rate well below any commercial rate, a repayment schedule of $200 monthly beginning 4 months after disbursement to give Sandra time to recover from whatever procedure she was facing, and standard language specifying that the loan would be considered in default, with the full remaining balance becoming immediately due if payments were missed for more than 60 consecutive days. The argument over the paperwork itself lasted longer than I've let on, and it's worth being honest about how close it came to derailing the entire precaution before it even existed. Marcus told me, at one point during that conversation, that he worried I was treating his mother like a stranger applying for an auto loan rather than someone who had raised him, and that if word got back to her that I'd insisted on notarization specifically, she would never let either of us forget it. I told him I understood the discomfort, but that the size of the request was simply too large to handle any other way, and that if the situation were reversed, if my own mother had asked him for $31,000, I would want exactly the same protection in place, not because I distrusted her, but because large numbers deserve clarity regardless of who's asking. Marcus went quiet for a long moment, then said something that, looking back, I wish I had pressed harder on at the time. You're probably right. I just don't want this to be the thing that finally makes her see you as the enemy she's always kind of suspected you were. I asked him what he meant by that, and he brushed it off, saying only that his mother had old-fashioned ideas about daughters-in-law and money, and that it was probably nothing. I let it go, focused on finishing the document, and did not fully understand until much later exactly how much history was compressed into that one deflected sentence. I met Sandra at her kitchen table to review it before wiring the funds, walked her through each section aloud, and watched her skim it with the particular impatience of someone who had already decided the document was a formality rather than a fact, signing at the bottom without asking a single question about the repayment terms I had just explained to her directly. I had a neighbor of hers, a retired notary named Mrs. Whitfield who lived 2 doors down, witness and notarize the signature the following afternoon, a small extra step that, at the time, felt like unnecessary caution and would later prove to be the single most important decision I made in this entire story. I wired the $31,000 to Sandra's account the next morning, and for the first month, everything proceeded exactly as the document specified. No drama, no complaints, simply a family member receiving help during what I still believed, at that point, was a genuine medical emergency. The first sign that something didn't quite align came roughly 6 weeks later, when Dominic, Marcus's younger brother, posted photographs on social media from a 2-week trip to Cabo San Lucas with his girlfriend, captioned with something about finally being able to breathe after months of financial stress. I didn't think much of it initially, assuming Dominic had simply had a stroke of unrelated good fortune, until Marcus mentioned, almost in passing over dinner, that his mother had helped cover part of Dominic's trip because, in Sandra's words, he had been under so much pressure lately and deserved a break. I remember setting my fork down very carefully and asking Marcus to repeat what he just said, because the timeline arithmetic happening in my head did not produce a comfortable answer. Sandra had received $31,000 for an urgent medical procedure 6 weeks earlier, and was now, apparently, in a financial position to fund a portion of her other son's vacation. I did not immediately confront Sandra, partly because I still held out hope for an innocent explanation, and partly because my professional training had taught me that premature accusations, without documentation to support them, tend to simply alert the person you're investigating to become more careful rather than more honest. Instead, I did what I did professionally with any borrower whose financial behavior didn't match their stated circumstances. I quietly began paying closer attention. When the first scheduled payment came due 4 months after disbursement, exactly as the loan agreement specified, no payment arrived. I waited a week, assuming perhaps an oversight, then sent Sandra a polite text reminder referencing the agreed schedule. She responded that she was still recovering financially from the medical expenses and asked whether we could revisit the schedule once she was, in her words, back on her feet. I agreed to a short grace period, genuinely wanting to extend the same reasonable flexibility I would offer any borrower experiencing a documented hardship, and told her we could discuss adjusting the schedule once she had a clearer sense of her situation. 2 more months passed without payment, without further communication about revising the schedule, and without, as far as I could observe, any actual hardship consistent with someone still recovering from a $31,000 medical emergency. Sandra posted, during that same window, photographs from a kitchen renovation, new countertops and cabinetry that, based on comparable projects I had reviewed professionally for home equity loan applications, likely cost somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. When I finally raised the missed payments directly with Marcus, asking whether he'd noticed the same pattern I had, he grew visibly uncomfortable, suggesting that perhaps his mother had simply prioritized the kitchen because the old countertops were, in his words, actually falling apart and posed a safety concern. An explanation that might have satisfied me had it not directly contradicted every previous conversation in which Sandra had described her financial situation, as still recovering from medical expenses too severe to permit resuming loan payments. I finally called Sandra directly about the kitchen, rather than continuing to route my concerns through Marcus, telling myself that a direct conversation, adult to adult, might resolve the growing unease more honestly than another relayed, second-hand exchange. She answered brightly, as she always did, and when I mentioned, as gently as I could manage, that I'd seen the renovation photos and wanted to understand the timing given the missed loan payments, her tone shifted almost instantly from warmth to wounded surprise. "Hannah, I can't believe you're tracking my countertops," she said, with a small laugh clearly meant to make my question sound absurd rather than reasonable. I told her I wasn't tracking anything. I simply wanted to understand how the household could afford a significant renovation while describing itself as unable to resume a $200 monthly payment. She told me the renovation had actually been financed separately, through a home improvement line of credit Gerald had arranged, and that the timing was coincidental, nothing more than a project they'd been planning for years that happened to move forward around the same time. I asked, since we were already discussing finances, whether she could send me any documentation of that separate financing, purely, I said, so I could stop worrying about the coincidence. The pause before her response lasted just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. "I don't have to prove my finances to you," she said, her voice cooling considerably. "I'm your husband's mother, not your borrower." I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that under the agreement she'd signed, she actually was exactly that, and ended the call before either of us said something we couldn't walk back from a week before her 60th birthday dinner. The 60th birthday dinner arrived roughly 7 months after I'd wired the money, at a point where Sandra had missed 3 consecutive scheduled payments, well past the 60-day default threshold specified in the agreement, though I had not yet formally invoked that clause, still hopping, against increasingly obvious evidence that some reasonable explanation existed for the pattern I was observing. I had mentioned, gently, earlier that same week, that I hoped we could sit down soon and discuss a realistic repayment plan given the missed payments, a request Sandra had waved off at the time as something we could handle later, without the stress of business talk complicating a nice family visit. I understand now that she had likely spent that entire week anticipating exactly the kind of public confrontation she orchestrated at Antonio's, choosing her own birthday dinner specifically because she calculated, correctly in most families and incorrectly in mine, that I would never risk embarrassing her in front of 18 relatives by pressing the issue in that setting. "Real family doesn't need written agreements," she announced, loud enough for the entire table to hear, framing my professional caution as some kind of cold, transactional betrayal of family loyalty. Several relatives laughed the uncomfortable laugh people offer when they want to believe a joke exists even when it clearly doesn't. Gerald, my father-in-law, stared hard at his plate, the particular stillness of a man who suspected something was wrong, but had spent 35 years of marriage learning it was easier not to ask. Marcus, beside me, said absolutely nothing, and that silence, more than Sandra's performance itself, told me precisely how this dinner was going to end if I allowed her narrative to stand unchallenged. I smiled, took a slow sip of water, and said only, "Noted, Sandra." The same quiet, controlled response I had spent 9 years perfecting for borrowers who tried to talk their way around documentation rather than through it. She smiled back, visibly satisfied, believing she had successfully repositioned herself as the wronged party in front of an audience I would never publicly contradict. I did not argue with her that night. I finished my dinner, complimented the tiramisu, and drove home with Marcus in a silence considerably heavier than the one that had settled over the table after her comment. The following morning, before Marcus had even finished his coffee, I sat down at our kitchen table with the original notarized loan agreement and drafted a formal notice of default, citing the 3 consecutive missed payments, the 60-day threshold specified in Section 4 of the agreement, and the resulting acceleration clause that made the full remaining balance. Now standing at just under $29,000 after accounting for 2 early partial payments Sandra had made before the pattern of missed payments began, immediately due in full. I sent the notice by certified mail directly to Sandra, along with a copy to her attorney, a man named Preston Hale who had handled her late father's estate years earlier and remained, as far as the family knew, her general legal contact for anything requiring professional letterhead. I chose to loop in her own attorney deliberately, not out of unnecessary escalation, but because I understood, from years of watching borrowers respond very differently to communication from a spouse or family member versus communication that had entered a formal legal channel, that Sandra needed to understand this was no longer a conversation she could manage through charm at a dinner table. I called my coworker and closest friend at the credit union, a senior underwriter named Renata Ford, that same afternoon, needing someone who understood both the mechanics of what I'd just done and the specific, isolating discomfort of doing it to family rather than a stranger across a desk. Renata had handled her own share of difficult collection conversations over the years and listened to the entire timeline without interrupting: the kitchen renovation, the Cabo trip, the deflected phone call, the certified notice now sitting in Sandra's mailbox. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Hannah, if this were a stranger's files sitting on your desk right now, missed payments, contradicted stated purpose, lifestyle spending inconsistent with claimed hardship, what would you have done 4 months ago instead of 7? I told her, honestly, that I would have sent the default notice after the first missed payment, not the third. "Then you already know you were more patient with her than your own professional standards required," Renata said. "The only thing unusual here is that you let the relationship talk you into ignoring your own judgment for 3 extra months. That's not a flaw, Hannah. That's just what loving someone costs when they're not being honest with you." I sat with that assessment for a long time after we hung up, because it reframed something I'd been quietly blaming myself for, the sense that perhaps I'd moved too quickly, too coldly, when in fact I had done the opposite, extending exactly the kind of undocumented grace Sandra herself had insisted, at that birthday dinner, that I was incapable of offering. Preston Hale called me directly 2 days later, his tone considerably more measured than I expected given whatever version of events Sandra had likely provided him initially. He confirmed he had reviewed the notarized agreement, confirmed the signature and witness documentation appeared entirely valid, and asked, carefully, whether I intended to pursue formal collection proceedings or whether some negotiated resolution remained possible. I told him I was open to a reasonable repayment plan, exactly as I had been for the previous 3 months, but that any further informal flexibility depended entirely on Sandra acknowledging the debt, honestly, rather than continuing to characterize a legally binding agreement as an unreasonable imposition on family goodwill. Preston, to his credit, told me he intended to have a direct conversation with his client about the seriousness of ignoring a notarized default notice, a conversation that, I would later learn, did not go the way Sandra had anticipated when she first called him expecting sympathy rather than sober legal counsel. What happened next unfolded with a speed that surprised even me, given how slowly the previous 7 months had crawled. Sandra called Marcus in visible distress within hours of speaking with Preston, and Marcus, for the first time throughout this entire situation, came home that evening and asked me, directly and without his usual deflection, whether I actually intended to sue his mother. I told him I intended to enforce a legally binding agreement his mother had voluntarily signed, reviewed line by line before signing, and had over 200 days to honor before I sent a single formal notice, and that whether it escalated to actual litigation depended entirely on choices that remained hers to make, not mine. Marcus sat with that for a long moment, and then, in a shift I hadn't fully anticipated, asked a different question. "Hannah, where did the medical emergency money actually go?" I told him I didn't know for certain, but that the timeline of Dominic's vacation and the kitchen renovation raised questions I had noticed for months and hadn't wanted to voice without more information. Marcus, to his credit, once he finally engaged seriously with the pattern rather than his mother's framing of it, called Dominic directly that same night. Dominic, apparently unaware that Marcus and I were now comparing notes, rather than simply absorbing Sandra's version of events separately, answered with far less caution than he might have if he'd understood what Marcus already suspected. He confirmed that Sandra had given him $8,000 toward the Cabo trip roughly 6 weeks after supposedly receiving the loan for her medical emergency, describing it casually as help she'd offered after her health scare resolved better than expected, and she found herself with some unexpected breathing room. Marcus asked, directly, whether their mother had actually undergone any medical procedure at all during that period. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Marcus later told me he assumed the call had dropped, before Dominic finally admitted he wasn't entirely sure, that Sandra had mentioned feeling unwell around that time, but he'd never actually seen a bill, a diagnosis, or any documentation, and had simply assumed, the way family members often assume, that pressing for details would seem unnecessarily suspicious of their own mother. That admission opened a door none of us had been prepared to walk through. I contacted Preston Hale again, this time asking whether Sandra could provide any documentation supporting the original medical emergency that had justified the loan request in the first place, not out of vindictiveness, but because the loan agreement itself, which I had drafted carefully, specified the stated purpose of the funds as a material term, and evidence that the stated purpose had been fabricated would strengthen any eventual collection action considerably while also, frankly, answering a question I now genuinely needed answered for my own peace of mind. Preston, after another conversation with Sandra that he described to me only in the most careful, professional terms, informed me that his client had, in fact, undergone a minor outpatient procedure during that period, but that the actual out-of-pocket cost, once insurance coverage was properly applied, had been closer to $4,000 rather than the $31,000 she had originally described to me over the phone. I sat with that number for a long time after Preston delivered it, doing the kind of mental accounting that had defined my entire career, and arrived at an uncomfortable but increasingly clear picture. Sandra had genuinely experienced a minor medical procedure, real enough to build a believable emergency around, but had inflated the actual cost by nearly $27,000, using the credible portion of her story to extract far more money than the situation actually required, then distributed the surplus toward a vacation for Dominic, a kitchen renovation for herself, and, as further documentation eventually revealed during the formal collection proceedings, roughly $6,000 toward a timeshare deposit in Florida that Gerald, her own husband, told me during a private conversation weeks later he had known absolutely nothing about until my collection notice forced the entire financial picture into daylight. Gerald's reaction, when he finally understood the full scope of what his wife had done, surprised me more than almost anything else in this story. He called me directly, something he had never done in 8 years of knowing him, and told me, in a voice that carried more exhaustion than anger, that he had spent 35 years of marriage slowly learning not to ask too many questions about Sandra's financial decisions, because doing so reliably produced exactly the kind of scene she had orchestrated at her own birthday dinner, and that some part of him had suspected, without ever having proof, that her generosity toward Dominic over the years had been funded by sources considerably less voluntary than she ever admitted. He told me he intended to review their joint finances more carefully going forward, a small, quiet sentence that nonetheless represented, I suspected, a genuinely significant shift in a marriage that had operated for decades on a very specific, unspoken agreement not to look too closely at certain rooms. Gerald did not stop at simply reviewing their joint accounts going forward. Over the following weeks, methodically and with a thoroughness that surprised even Marcus, he requested full statement histories going back nearly 4 years, and what he found, he told me during a second, longer phone call, extended well beyond the $31,000 connected to my loan agreement. Sandra had, over that period, made a pattern of similar requests to various family members and even 2 longtime friends, always framed around a specific, sympathetic hardship, always for amounts calibrated, Gerald suspected once he saw them laid out together, to sit just below the threshold where any single person might feel comfortable demanding formal documentation. Rosalie's $4,000 car repair loan, it turned out, had not been an isolated quirk after all, but one entry in a longer ledger that Gerald was only now, in his own 60s, seeing assembled in full for the first time. He told me he felt less angry than simply, profoundly tired, the particular exhaustion of realizing a pattern you'd caught only fragments of for decades had, in fact, been a complete and coherent picture the entire time, one nobody had ever laid out fully enough for him to see. Sandra, once the full accounting became impossible to deny, attempted one final version of the narrative she had relied on successfully for most of her adult life, telling Marcus during a tearful phone call that she had only inflated the amount because she knew we wouldn't have given her enough otherwise, that Dominic needed the vacation more than any of us understood given his own struggles, and that families were supposed to help each other without treating every dollar like a courtroom exhibit. Marcus, for the first time in this entire situation, did not immediately soften. He told her, according to what he relayed to me afterward, that Hannah had drafted an agreement specifically to protect everyone, including her, and that lying about a medical emergency to extract $27,000 beyond the actual need wasn't generosity toward Dominic. It was theft from Marcus and me dressed up in language designed to make questioning it feel like cruelty. Sandra had no response to that reframing that didn't further undermine whatever remained of her original story. The formal collection proceedings, once initiated, moved with the particular efficiency that notarized agreements tend to produce in small claims contexts, since the documentation left remarkably little room for dispute. Sandra's attorney advised her, given the strength of the signed and witnessed agreement, that contesting the debt in court would likely prove both expensive and unsuccessful, and recommended instead negotiating a structured settlement, which we ultimately reached, an agreement requiring repayment of the full $29,000 remaining balance over 18 months, secured this time not merely by a signature at a kitchen table, but by a formal payment plan with automatic bank transfers that removed any future ambiguity about whether payments had actually occurred. Sandra agreed to the terms, not graciously, but with the particular resignation of someone who had finally run out of alternative narratives. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than the satisfaction of watching consequences finally arrive. I did not feel triumphant sending that certified notice, or hearing Preston Hale's careful voice confirm the inflated medical cost, or listening to Gerald's exhausted admission about 35 years of not asking questions. I felt mostly a quiet and specific sadness, the sadness of understanding that a woman I had spent years trying to build a genuine relationship with had decided, when it mattered most, that manipulating that relationship was worth more to her than honoring it. I did not enjoy watching Marcus's understanding of his own mother shift so painfully in the span of a single phone call to his brother. What I did allow myself to feel, and did not apologize for feeling, was a specific kind of professional and personal vindication, the vindication of having trusted my own careful instincts, the ones that insisted on a notarized signature even when doing so felt, at the time, unnecessarily cold toward a woman who was supposedly facing a medical crisis. Sandra completed her repayment plan roughly 14 months after the settlement, a full 4 months ahead of schedule, a detail I choose to interpret generously as evidence that some genuine remorse eventually accompanied the financial reckoning, even if it arrived only after every alternative narrative had been exhausted. Our relationship has not returned to whatever version of warmth existed before that birthday dinner, and I've made peace with the likelihood that it may never fully recover that particular texture, though we maintain a careful, functional cordiality at family gatherings, the kind built more on mutual practicality than genuine closeness. Dominic, to his credit, reached out to me directly several months after everything settled, apologizing not for the vacation itself, which he maintained he genuinely hadn't understood the origin of at the time, but for not asking harder questions when the timeline should have concerned him the same way it concerned me. Gerald and I have grown, unexpectedly, considerably closer since that phone call, an unplanned friendship built on the specific solidarity of two people who both, in different ways, Learned to stop accepting comfortable stories simply because questioning them felt unkind. Sandra's 61st birthday arrived roughly 4 months after the settlement was finalized, and the family gathered again at Antonio's, the same restaurant, the same 2 pushed-together tables. Though the guest list had quietly shrunk from 18 relatives to 11, several extended family members apparently having heard enough of the full story through the usual channels to feel it wiser to send a card instead. Sandra made no toast about family and paperwork this time. She thanked everyone for coming, mentioned, briefly and without elaboration, that the past year had taught her some things about honesty she wished she'd learned decades earlier, and sat down before the moment could stretch into anything resembling the speech she'd given the year before. I did not gloat, and did not expect an apology to arrive wrapped in a birthday toast, but I noticed, watching her sit down, that Gerald reached over and took her hand in a way that felt less like celebration, and more like 2 people quietly recommitting to something they were both still working out how to rebuild. I raised my glass along with everyone else when the waiter brought out the cake, and for the first time in over a year, the gesture didn't feel like performance on anyone's part, mine included. Marcus and I spent months working through what the entire situation revealed about patterns in his family. He had absorbed so completely growing up that he'd never fully recognized them as patterns at all. The reflexive instinct to avoid documentation because documentation implied distrust. The assumption that love and financial accountability existed in permanent tension rather than being, as I had spent my entire career quietly believing. 2 things that actually protect each other when done honestly. He told me, months later, that watching me stay calm through that entire birthday dinner, smiling and saying only noted, while his mother tried to publicly reframe basic financial honesty as coldness, had taught him something about steadiness he hadn't fully appreciated before. That the loudest person in a room insisting they've been wronged isn't always the person who's actually been wronged. So here is the question I still find myself thinking about, more than a year later. If someone you loved asked you to extend trust without any record of what that trust actually obligated them to, and then used the absence of that record to quietly take far more than they needed, would you have caught it as early as I did, or would you have kept extending grace long after the numbers stopped adding up? I would love to know whether you think documentation between family members is protective, or, as Sandra insisted at that dinner table, evidence of a love that's already gone cold. Share your perspective in the comments, because someone reading your answer tonight might need permission to understand that a signature isn't the opposite of love. Sometimes it's simply love that's willing to survive contact with the truth. This video is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection. All names, characters, and events are fictional. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you enjoy stories about quiet strength, financial boundaries, and the kind of family accountability that protects relationships instead of destroying them, subscribe to Sweet Vindication, and we'll see you in the next one.